Hi everyone, welcome to this afternoon's event, AAPI, Solidarities and Fault Lines. I'm Dr. Kimbra Smith from the Department of Anthropology, and today we have here with us George Bayuga, Suhan Mehta, Ilaheva Tuaone, and Stefan Suh. And I'd like to also thank the Center for hosting this event. Thank you to our speakers and our audience today. George?
Hi, my name is George Bayuga. I'm an instructor in the Department of Anthropology. I'm a China anthropologist who focuses on transnational religious movement between mainland China, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Hong Kong.
Ilaheva?
Hi, I'm Dr. Ilaheva Tuaone, and I'm an assistant professor of Native American and Indigenous Studies in the Women's and Ethnic Studies Department. And I study mostly 18th and 19th century travel narratives, trans-Pacific, of the Pacific Ocean.
Suhan?
Hi, I'm Suhan Kiran Mehta. I am an assistant professor in the English department. I do research on South Asian literatures and cultures, and some of the courses I teach are 20th and 21st century global Anglophone literature, critical theory, and 20th century British literature. It's good to be with you all.
And Stefan?
Hi, everybody. This is Stefan Cho Suh. I'm an assistant professor of sociology and women's and ethnic studies at UCCS. And generally speaking, I research and teach on the topics of race, gender, migration, identity, and culture, especially as it relates to the Korean diaspora and Asian Americans.
So the first question that I would like to ask each of you, and I'm going to start with George, how do you understand the category Asian American and Pacific Islander?
Thank you very much, Kimbra. This question, I think, is really important to see in the context of individual people's experiences, because my experience may be different from, say, Stefan's experience or Suhan's experience or Ilaheva's experience. And for me, this question manifested as an experience of hyphenation from a very young age. And when I say hyphenation, I mean this idea of the tension between Asian and American was something that was very salient to me since I was maybe about 7, wandering outside with my family and my family saying things like, this is what the Americans do, and then this is what we do. And at that moment, I didn't really fully understand what that meant. I didn't understand that my family was using American as a broad valence for white. I didn't know what white meant at that point in time. And as I got older, Asian American became a very tangible experience for me of straddling this idea that I'm taught in school that anybody can be an American. Everybody's American, right? Americans can look like anybody. But at the same time, I have this sense of my family with a particular experience of being other in America. And then as I get older, I have an experience of being other myself, where Asian American means that I get asked questions like, do you know Kung Fu? What are you eating? You know, what, you know, why do you speak another language? All these types of questions end up becoming a marker of me associating Asian American with a sense of not necessarily having a solid place in the American imaginary.
Thank you. Ilaheva?
Yeah, this question, it was also brought up to me at a very young age. I'm going to speak about the Pacific Islander portion of AAPI. And the question to me is, or the term to me is too broad. It is not narrowly enough defined. And specifically when it comes to Asian and Pacific Islander relationships, because there has been a long history of Asian colonization across the Pacific Islands, and so the a certain amount of violence too, and so the term is fraught and too narrowly defined. And even when I went to the doctor this morning and had to fill out a form, and the question when it came to race, the options were white, Black, Asian, Latino. Not even a question for a mark for other as and so you know the attention that has been placed on AAPI violence has it's violence specifically against Asian Americans and not Pacific Islander people. And so placing Pacific Islanders in that category doesn't in this case doesn't pay enough specific attention to the violence that's going on directed towards specifically Asian Americans and not Pacific Islanders. So for me, the term is too broad.
Thank you. Suhan?
Okay, so as I said, I work in the area of South Asian literature and cultures with a particular focus on India and Pakistan. Now, South Asia itself includes Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. And at times, you know, depending on which source you're looking at, Afghanistan is included in the list. So as you can imagine, the categories of South Asia and therefore South Asian American are very capacious to begin with. And just like Elaheva was saying, I think the place of the South Asian American diaspora in the category of Asian American has been contentious. And there are, you know, historical and geopolitical reasons for this. And it is articulated really well in an anthology titled Apart Yet Apart that I found exceedingly useful while thinking about this question. So the writer in the foreword, he notes that, you know, that in the 20th century, East and Southeast Asia have just been more central to the American identity than South Asia. And there's a telling quote in the foreword where he says that, you know, arming India against China and Pakistan against the former Soviet Union hardly compares with completely exhausting US manpower and drafting its common citizenry during the Vietnam War. The other reason for this sort of like this imperfect overlap, right, is that various Asian American immigrant communities have been othered at different times in American history. Now, the immediate context for this teach-in event, right, has been anti-East and anti-Southeast Asian, and as Elaheva was saying, anti-Pacific Islander violence, right? On the other hand, at the start of this century, in the aftermath of 9/11, individuals from various South Asian American communities were victims of Islamophobia. And the tenuous relationship between these two categories, or subcategory and a category, if that's how you want to see it, is also seen in how South Asian American studies has historically viewed itself in relation to Asian American studies. So even when starting in the late 1980s, you had influential scholars such as Shirley Hune and Lisa Lowe who've written about the need to expand Asian American studies to include Southeast Asian and South Asian experiences and expressions. And one of the earliest scholars to have made this argument of South Asian origin was Sucheta Mazumdar. And she asks that, is it not ironic that Asian American studies should become the vehicle for a progress of homogenization of immigrants, which strips away multiple layers of ethnic identity in favor of a single census category? So with that said, just a couple of years after the publication of Apart Yet Apart, the writers note in a paper published in 2000 that Asian American studies has been significantly more accommodating of South Asian American scholarship. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. And Stefan?
Yeah, so excellent responses so far, and I have just a little bit to add. So as a professor who teaches Asian American studies, I, at the beginning of each semester in my Asian American Communities course, intentionally mention how this is a course about Asian American lives and histories. And while we do touch upon Pacific Islander communities and identities, because of the aforementioned colonization of the Pacific Islands by many Asian colonial powers, the settler colonialism of Asian immigrants to various Pacific Island nations and countries throughout the 20th century, it's impossible to disentangle Asian American and Pacific Island lives and histories completely. But I don't think that my course on Asian American communities focuses enough on Pacific Island studies and histories to do that population justice. And so I think first and foremost that AAPI or Asian American and Pacific Islander, these are all pan-ethnic categorizations, right? So even Pacific Islander is a pan-ethnic categorization, as is Asian American or Asian. And they are combined or they're created for largely political purposes. And so I understand the political utility of having Asian American and Pacific Islander or Pacific Islander Americans combined into one entity, but I see them largely as separate. And I feel like given the increased size, visibility, and settler tendencies of Asians in the United States, as well as the reality that many who identify as Pacific Islander American occupy lands that have been colonized by the United States, for example, there are reasons to separate these populations. And so even as AAPI has served its political purpose over the past several decades, I don't know that it still does, or it still has the same gravity or weight to it. So I'd only advocate for keeping AAPI as a moniker if it were Pacific Islander communities who were advocating or interested in doing so. But I get the feeling that they wouldn't, because Pacific Islander voices are typically lost or dismissed or not given enough justice, I would say, in discussions about AAPI communities writ large.
And we'll come back to some of those questions in a bit as well. In talking about the complexities, on the one hand, of having these broad overarching categories, I'd also like to ask you each about kind of the flip side of that. Have you ever struggled with the idea of fitting into a diasporic cultural community? And I'd like to start with Suhan.
Yeah. So since I'm going first, I'll just do some, bare minimal definitional work by drawing on Paul Gilroy and Rogers Brubaker before I answer the question directly. So historically speaking, diaspora refers to a relational network that is created by forced dispersal and reluctant scattering. These are Gilroy's words. And in the historical sense, right, this network is comprised of individuals fleeing various unspeakable terrors, with the Jewish diaspora being a paradigmatic example. And the term diaspora has since then been extended to include various immigrant groups who have, had varying degrees of political involvement with the country of their birth, or work overseas but feel emotionally and socially connected with their homeland. So with significant qualifications, I fall into the latter category. Born in what was then Bombay and is now Mumbai, India, I came to America in fall of 2004 to do graduate work in English at the Ohio State University, note, right? And I am one of 18 million Indians living outside of India. So it should come as no surprise that this is hardly a monolithic group. So it might be more appropriate to speak of the Indian diaspora in the plural. Now, as for the question, I you see, the thing is, I do not belong to any one of the holy trinity of acceptable professions, namely engineering or medicine, finance. And I've also gathered from the Indian matrimonial website shadi.com that being a lawyer is okay as long as one is practicing corporate law. Now, so to avoid answering all these kinds of awkward questions to well-meaning but very inquisitive Indian uncles and aunties about what is it that I exactly do, I've turned to virtual spaces to stay informed and have conversations about what is happening in India and indeed the world. And more specifically, with the serious undermining of press freedoms in India, the more committed and courageous journalists and satirists have created digital platforms to disseminate the news. These are small operations that are almost exclusively funded by viewers scattered all across the globe, and who also would like to have the opportunity to engage in meaningful dialogue about the pressing issues of the day. And rather than serve as echo chambers, these web platforms are spaces where one can agree to disagree, and that's where I feel most welcome. Thanks.
Thank you, George. George, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Kimbra, and thank you very much, Suhan, for setting up such a great foundation. As an anthropologist, one of the things that interests me about this question is this idea of what a diaspora is and how is it experienced depending upon what community that you're part of. You know, being a member of the global Black diaspora is very different from being a member of the global South Asian diaspora, or the group that I am most closely related to is the global Filipino diaspora. And for me, the Filipino diaspora had a very, very specific kind of manifestation. That is, basically my ancestral village in the Philippines all moved to the United States within about a 30-year period, and they set up a club in the United States that actually has regular events at high holidays where all the members of this village who had immigrated over, plus all their kids and all their kids' kids, continue to meet regularly and hang out and eat awkward chicken dinners at hotels in various places across California. And they continue this tradition until well, maybe not for the pandemic, but you know, up until several years, they're still going. And these organizations are super important parts of bringing members of this diasporic community together, but also in terms of generating resources and funds to go back and support the family village back home. So for me, diaspora had a very specific institutional manifestation. Now, this idea of what does it mean for me to struggle to be part of it has very much been rooted in sort of my own identity as a sort of multi-ethnic Filipino American. The first is that in these spaces, I've kind of had to hide my queer identity or not necessarily foreground that as much in these particular spaces. And because these particular diasporic spaces are spaces of kin reproduction, to use anthropological language, you know, you also get hit with a lot of kin reproduction questions. Where's your girlfriend? Are you married yet? You know, what are your plans for the future? You know, when are you going to be bringing your little one to this next event? And a lot of times these questions seem like very innocent, you know, small talk, right? It's just what you ask. It's just what you say to people to figure out how they're doing in their lives. But at the same time, when you have what might be considered a non-normative identity, it can put you on the spot where you have to, for example, for me, I have to out myself and be like, sorry, you know, Lola, I don't have a girlfriend right now. I'm focusing on my studies, which is like a classic, you know, line that you use over and over again to try to sidestep and not create a scene. But in many ways, the struggle for me of fitting into the diasporic community is this constant dance of sidestepping knowing what are the safe spaces for me to articulate this identity that I've cultivated for myself in the United States, but noting that that identity itself is in flux as I have to code switch in between the communities that I'm speaking to at any given moment.
Thank you. Stefan?
Yeah, so I've definitely struggled with notions of diaspora identity, ethnic identity, and so forth. I think this is evident in the work that I do. I oftentimes, classify my research as me-search, given that most of what I do centers around my own personal interests and queries. But I think my struggle has largely come from this pressure of what is normative and what is expected. In this case, the expectation to conform to the ideals of a specific community, regardless of how you might identify personally or otherwise, and where and when you live, right? So for example, my parents are from South Korea, and I was raised in a city, Los Angeles, where there is a very strong Korean immigrant presence. And within the space, there are several competing versions of like Koreanness or Korean culture that are always kind of like vying for like top dog status. And that one depending on like your age or generational cohort is expected to adhere to. So there's a version of Koreanness, for example, that was most salient to people like myself, in this case, children of immigrants, second, third generation Korean Americans. There's a version of Koreanness that was most salient to Korean immigrants like my parents living in Los Angeles. There was a version of Koreanness that was most salient to all Korean expats who are living in any part of the country or any part of the world. And then there's a version of Koreanness that is most salient in South Korea. And the question becomes, at least for people within the diaspora, is which version of this Koreanness has the most gravity and the most weight? And I imagine most would argue that it's the version emerging from South Korea, because what is Koreanness and Korean culture without the Korean peninsula, right? But I think this explanation is too overly simplistic, and also essentializes notions of culture and identity instead of seeing them as social constructions and human creations, right? So the way I see it, as a person born or as a person with Korean ancestry, I have every right to claim that my second generation Korean American understanding of Koreanness is as viable or as real as Koreanness that comes from the Korean Peninsula. So what is Koreanness if not the lived realities and experiences and identities of Korean people? And if I view myself as Korean, which I do, why should my interpretation of Koreanness matter any less than someone who was born and raised in the Korean Peninsula? So it's questions like these that I often like wrestle with, that have also often gotten me into like arguments and fights with other Koreans and really just people in general. So the struggle is definitely real.
Thank you. Ilaheva?
Thank you all for setting up this conversation so well. And the Tongan diaspora I'm one of 200,000 people in the Tongan diaspora, and there's only a little more than 300,000 Tongans on Earth. So this is a very small population. And because of this, I'm often the only possibly Pacific Islander in the room. And being the only Pacific Islander in the room confirms my identity. My identity is only in question when I meet with other Tongans. And the way that they protect their identity with such a small population is through the language and whether or not you can speak the language. I come from a really large family, and my older sisters were able to learn the language, but it wasn't taught to the younger ones of us. And so it was often like my cousins would tease us for not being able to speak the language, Tongan. And and that's often how the your Tonganness is measured, how well you speak the language. And since I don't, I had to find other ways to confirm my identity. And my identity then, my Pacific Islander identity then, and authenticity is confirmed for me always whenever I go into public and people ask where I'm from, or people assume that I'm from somewhere else, and seeing my name and asking about my name. And so what I'm trying to say is that I feel Tongan inside of me, whether or not I can live up to those identity standards. I still feel Tongan whether or not I can speak the language. And I think that's so important for other Indigenous communities and Indigenous students that might not feel a connection to their tribe or people because they don't have that language. And so yeah, this authenticity is fraught, especially with such a small population and a small, narrow definition of what it does mean to be Tongan, which was never really defined for me, except through this access through language.
Thank you. So listening to all your perspectives on how you negotiate your own expressions of cultural identity, of connection, of belonging, of who gets to adjudicate who belongs and who doesn't. All of these are kind of tying into the question that Ilaheva just brought up about authenticity. Why do you think we place such emphasis on this idea of authenticity, especially when you're all expressing and articulating this question of, well, there are these identities set up that I have to either fit into or sidestep, I have to code switch. These are constructions, but I still have to fight for my right to express my identity the way I want to. Why do we place that emphasis on the idea of authenticity? What do we mean by that? Why do you think it is so valued? Sorry, let's start with George.
Thank you so much, Kimbra, for this very engaging question. I think the first thing to sort of put out there is that authenticity is predicated on a certain type of essentialized identity. For Ilaheva, it was an essentialized identity, an essential linguistic identity. But oftentimes, the contents of that essence can shift depending upon who you're talking to or the group that you're working with, or even just people that are speaking about their own experiences. And I think part of the reason why a lot of folks sort of hold on to essentialized notions of identity, and I'm just going to sort of paraphrase a lot of ethnography, but sometimes groups form identities around this idea of collective suffering together. People who, groups of people, Asian immigrants, Pacific Islanders, Asian Americans, when you encounter similar types of struggle, sometimes people look for categorical similarities that allow people to create ties that bind them together. And this creates safety, this creates a sense of community, this creates a sense of solidarity. But in as much as it includes people, it also sets up the grounds for exclusion. When people don't speak, when people don't look like somebody, when people don't dress a certain way, all of these things, in as much as they can bring people together, are also the grounds for separating people and excluding them. And I don't know how many in the audience have encountered the Facebook group Subtle Asian Traits, which has made its rounds in global media at some point in time. But one of the things that I, as an anthropologist observer of this Facebook group, find particularly fascinating is that a lot of the discussions in this group hinge around essentialized discussions of Asian and Asian American identity. And the thing is, this Facebook group, explicitly says this group is for people to share their experiences of being Asian, right? Of being Asian. And it's like literally that could be anything. But at the same time, they go through and censor a lot of possible posts from things that aren't deemed as Asian enough. I mean, at one point in time, I'm teaching classes in Asian studies, and one of my students produced a very exciting video about a book that has to do with Asia, but because the student who was presenting the video was not Asian, they didn't, I got censored. Like, I'm an affiliate faculty in an Asian studies program. I speak 2 Asian languages, and I can't post to this group because the people who are running the group have a certain notion of a centralized Asian identity. So I think on the one hand, authenticity has roots in a desire to create community, to create a sense of shared experience where people can comfort each other amidst their sufferings and celebrate with each other amidst joy. But at the same time, I think one of the unintended consequences of authenticity discourse is the issue of exclusion.
Thank you. Stefan?
So I'll piggyback off of several things that George so eloquently mentioned. So I think authenticity is valued for different reasons by different people in different communities. So if we think about like marginalized or indigenous communities, authenticity can be the measure through which that group maintains its traditions and collective identity. And without a recognition of what is authentic or traditional, there is a very real existential threat to the continued existence of that community's practices and identity. It's worth noting that there are dangers to this logic when it extends beyond marginalized communities. And I want to begin by stating that culture is not static, right? So neither is it natural or innate or inherent. So if we think about culture, both anthropologically and sociologically speaking, culture doesn't exist in and of itself. It's the collection of responses and practices developed by a group of people in response to their very specific environments and conditions. And as sociologists like to say, culture emerges from structure. Culture is given meaning through the very conditions and peoples through which it is created. The danger then of seeing culture or certain forms of culture as authentic is in its inability to exclude other forms of culture from this category of authenticity, as George pointed out. Take, for example, France's response to the influx of Muslim immigrants over the past several decades, mostly from North Africa. Inevitably, with the influx of new peoples, there will be the introduction of new cultural practices and identities. And I know this given that I teach about migration globally. So clothing and garb are some of those cultural practices. However, France views itself to be a secular nation to the point where secularism is seen as an authentic de facto characteristic of France's culture and collective identity. So this notion of authenticity then is used to justify the exclusion of Muslim garb, such as face coverings, to uphold France's veneer of secularism, right? So we see then how authenticity is used to justify exclusion and the subordination of specific cultural practices and the people associated with those practices. A similar comparison about the dangers of claiming cultural authenticity also exists in places like China, where the Chinese Communist Party has permitted the exclusion and marginalization of the Uighur ethnic minority community, again, on this basis of secularism being a staple of contemporary Chinese culture. I think more generally, I think the dangers of authenticity as a discourse lies in its increasing commodification and use as justification for consumption. And this is something that I am very interested in and I do quite a bit of research on. So with the rise of things like foodieism, for example, or foodie culture, or just generally the rise of global travel and tourism, there's been this increasing lust for and fetishization of cultures and cultural practices and products that are viewed to be authentic or indigenous. So things that are considered to be like undisturbed, unperturbed by capitalism and mass consumption. Now, on the surface, this might seem harmless, even like laudable, given that it seems to celebrate things like cultural open-mindedness, cultural sharing, cultural pluralism, all of which are esteemed liberal values. What's typically not reflected upon is who is doing this consumption and for what purpose, and to whom does this notion of authenticity matter the most and why. For example, when an American foodie determines while with his friends that a Hmong restaurant in town is authentic and thus worthwhile to visit, is it to ensure the preservation of Hmong cultures and peoples, or is it to elevate their own status as a worldly and cosmopolitan food adventurer? When a Native American street vendor in Santa Fe, New Mexico sells traditional jewelry and Kokopelli figures to out-of-state tourists, is it because these authentic representations of Native culture are intensely meaningful to them and their communities at that very moment? Or is it because they know that the same people who don't give a crap about Native American genocide and indigenous sovereignty also want to buy authentic Indian souvenirs from an authentic Indian? So I feel that the conversations around authenticity are often disingenuous at best and largely ask the worst questions, or the wrong questions at worst. The question should be less about, is this person or cultural practice authentic, and more about why do you and we care, right? So what purpose and to whose benefit does it serve for this cultural practice to be deemed authentic? And it's through these questions that we begin to realize that the way that authenticity as a discourse exists is keenly aligned with and informed by existing structures and hierarchies of power.
Thank you, Stefan. That was a fantastic overview. Ilaheva?
Thank you, Stefan. I couldn't have said it better myself. And George, for saying such great thoughts. And my answer is not as good or as complete as yours. But I also question this question of authenticity, and it worries me the dangers of the question itself. I feel when people ask about authenticity, it is basic part of systemic racism, because you're only calling on certain races to prove their authenticity. And I see it a lot in 18th century literature as well. Which texts are called upon to see whether or not they are authentic or not, and the lengths that historians and literary historians will go to prove that something is not authentic. When something that is written by a European person in the 18th century, if they don't feel like it's authentic, they call it fiction, rather than questioning its authenticity. So I worry about this, about authenticity a lot, not only for its essentializing and also for its exclusion and inclusion practices, but who is called upon to prove their authenticity in the first place, and why?
Thank you. And I'll come back to that before the next question. Suhan?
Okay, so thanks for these exceedingly rich responses from various disciplinary perspectives. I can think of the question of authenticity in the field of South Asian literature in terms of its relationship to the English language. And this ties in somewhat with what Ilaheva was saying about language as an identity, and even an identity marker. So a debate that refuses to die down, right, is, does the authentic South Asian writer write in the many languages that are indigenous to South Asia, or do they write in the language of the colonizer, right? And a variation of this question, and something which probably might speak more directly to this event, is what is South Asian about the South Asian American writer who is more comfortable in English than, say, in Assamese or Punjabi or Sinhala or what, or name you. Now, there's no saying that writers from various South Asian countries who write in English are highly visible in the world literary marketplace. They're often based in New York City or London, and at times work as permanent or visiting faculty in prestigious creative writing programs, whether in the United States or in the UK or Canada. And they write for prestigious outlets like The New Yorker, The Guardian, and even are invited to be guests on talk shows. Timothy Brennan has a good, he called them sort of third world cosmopolitans, right? And the best example of a third world cosmopolitan is the author Salman Rushdie, born in India, studied and lived in the UK for a significant portion of his life, and now based in New York City. Now, Rushdie is most infamous for the fatwa issued against him by Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini after the publication of his novel, The Satanic Verses. But he has ruffled feathers on other occasions as well. So at one point, this was in a publication in 1997, he writes that prose writing, both fiction and non-fiction, by Indian writers working in English, is proving to be a stronger and more important body of work than most of what has been produced in the 16 official languages of India, the so-called vernacular languages during the same time. As one can imagine, this wasn't received too kindly by the authors who write in these so-called vernacular languages. And an Indian writer who has vocally expressed his contempt for Rushdie and other third world cosmopolitans on more than one occasion is Balchandra Nemade, who writes in Marathi, which happens to be my mother tongue. And in an interview, Nemade said, and I've edited it a little bit, for the purpose of this event, is that he says that you walk through filth, the rain, dust, and dirt, the world outside. You need different shoes for that purpose. When you enter your house, though, you leave them outside. English is like that. You walk through filth by way of English, but don't bring it to your kitchen, right? There's more to be unpacked here, but I'm just going to stop.
I'm so tempted to unpack there. But I think rather than starting with unpacking that, I'm going to use it to jump into the next topic. If we want to talk about whiteness, which is something that a number of you have mentioned in one way or another, whiteness is often a confusing construction for members of, a dominant cultural group in the United States. And, I say this having the majority of my family members being from that dominant cultural group that does not understand what whiteness means. But if, as Stefan said, if it is through our social structures that culture is given meaning, and if dominant cultural groups have more say in defining what counts, and that question that some of you brought up, who's called on, like Ilaheva brought up, who's called on to prove their own authenticity? Nobody asks me whether I still speak Hungarian or whether I speak Scottish. So I wanted to ask you, how are all of these questions related to this concept of whiteness or white supremacy? Even something as simple as a common experience that you've all mentioned in our conversations previously, just, like being asked what language you speak or what you're from or what your name means. How is all that related to whiteness? And Ilaheva? You're muted, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for asking this question, Kimbra. And it came up for me recently because I had a person who is phenotypically white, ask me what they can do to combat racism every day. And at first I explained to her that brown people don't experience racism in the same way that Black people do. And differently also than Native American and Indigenous people. But one of the ways that brown people experience racism is through this constant orientalizing and constant othering. And so such a simple question as where are you from is in fact insidious and does damage, because it assumes first that you are not from the place that you are at. That by looking at me, you can tell that I must be from somewhere else. And when I'm not actually, you know, I have a mixed cultural heritage, and part of my family goes back 400s of years. But that part of the family is the part of the family that is always asking, where are you from? And it also assumes that the person asking belongs in the place where they're asking. They're asking that I am from here and you must be from somewhere else. And this question often comes from phenotypically white people here in America that assume that they've been there for so long that they actually belong there, and any other brown person does not belong there, and they must be from somewhere else. And so one of the, I feel like one of the most simple ways that you can combat racism inside of yourself is to not assume that everyone, that brown person that you see is not from the place that they are at, but to instead come from a different standpoint and assume that the person that you're talking to belongs in the place that they're at. It's an insidious question and a damaging one that people. It's these small ways of continuing systemic racism that we don't recognize, and it's just in a small way to combat racism. Simply is to take that question out of your lineup of questions.
Thank you. Suhan?
Okay, Kimbra, thanks for your question, and Leheva, thank you for your response. So I'm going to come at this question somewhat obliquely. So when I got here nearly 17 years ago, I was taken aback by how much where I'm from is actually in people's peripheral vision. And I felt that most acutely, say, on 26 November 2008, when the terrorist attack on Mumbai was like on nobody's radar screen, right? In 2015, a Nepali academic named Rajan Adiga had a similar experience following an earthquake in April of that year that led to nearly 9,000 deaths. And he wrote about this in the Chronicler of Higher Education. Now, you know, we all inhabit very different media ecologies, right? And it's unreasonable to expect individuals to be aware of everything that's happening in the globe all the time. Also, one doesn't know how exactly, you know, a particular immigrant relates to their home country, right? But with that said, when people do reach out, you feel somewhat less isolated in your adopted country. And to give you a very recent example, actually as recent as last few days, I was deeply touched when colleagues and friends here reached out to me in light of the exponential rise in COVID-19 cases in India, and the situation, you know, for anyone who's been following this is apocalyptic. What is more disquieting is how much is assumed about where I'm from on the basis of little to no knowledge about that part of the world. So in certain academic contexts, I talk about the part of the global south that I come from, or say the global south even more generally, I'm struck by how there is a tendency to reduce the global south to the sum of its problems. Now, I'll be the last person to say that one has to sanitize or look away from the inequities in another part of the world. However, rather than think about the globe self-reflexively, I mean, these discussions, at least occasionally, are used to reinforce the first and third world binary. And to my mind, this uncritical approach in thinking about parts of the global south stems from US exceptionalism, right? So that's how I can respond to that question. Thank you.
Thank you. Stefan?
Yeah, so my response to this question is pretty short and largely echoes what have already been stated by Elaheva and Suhan. So questions like, where are you from, alongside the kind of laundry list that we've already touched upon, they do a lot of things, but at their core, they presume that I'm other, right? As Elaheva so pointedly spoke of. So it doesn't matter that I was born in the United States and lived my entire life here. I'm presumed first and foremost to be foreigner, and this is an affliction that has plagued Asians in the U.S. for centuries, right? So often this foreignizing can be perceived simply as what we refer to as like microaggressions, like just minor slights that are often not meant to harm but have the effect of racially othering, like assuming that I'm an immigrant, or greeting me with an Asian language, or mistaking me for some other Asian dude at Starbucks, which happens quite frequently in Colorado Springs for whatever reason. These aren't physically violent, right? So, but that doesn't mean that they don't have some sort of negative impact on my psyche. But we've also seen this foreignizing can have far more direct and insidious repercussions, such as the decades-long exclusion of Asians from immigrating or naturalizing in the United States, to the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, to even the recent rise in COVID-related anti-Asian violence. So the small acts of othering are related to, and I would say indicative of, much larger systems of racism in the United States that have consistently racialized Asians as other, un-American, undeserving, outsider, foreigner, etc.
Thank you. George?
Oh, wow. Thank you very much, Kimbra, Suhan, Stefan, and Elaheva for such eloquent responses. I think the only thing that I want to add in many ways is that this question of, where are you from, this insidious question, is also presented in a variety of different ways that don't use those same words. And sort of, it also occurs performatively. And for me, this question has appeared most saliently with the comment, "Wow, your English is so good." And anybody who doesn't look like a particular kind of Anglo-American can probably recount at some point in time in their lives when somebody comments about why their English is so good. Now, I'm not going to necessarily go into that discussion, but I do want to highlight that in many ways, the relationship, the reproduction of racism in somebody saying to me, George, your English is so good, also exists in the kind of surprise and excitement that people have when somebody who is, for example, white, speaks a non-European language. So there are all these YouTube videos on the internet, TikToks of, white guy surprises Chinatown worker by speaking perfectly fluent Mandarin, or this, and those types of videos are dependent on, again, reifying a kind of essentialism where language is inherently tied to some essential notion of cultural identity, despite the fact that there are that people, that at least one anthropological definition of a person is the fact that a person can be somebody who moves around and lives and exists and thrives in different contexts, in different environments, and especially different languages and cultural spaces. So part of sort of what I want to end this question with is sort of the gentle reminder that this question of where are you from doesn't always come out with the language of where are you from. Sometimes it comes out in the more implicit way of people who aren't even Asian or aren't even people of color getting praise, for example, for speaking a language that is non-European.
Thank you. And George, you and I are anthropologists, and Stefan is in a very closely related discipline. And this anthropology as a colonial discipline that is, has historically been so focused on defining otherness through fixity, right? Through this is how we define someone else culturally. We're going to write in the present tense as though this group of people doesn't change, which, as you're all evoking, renders groups of people able to be depicted as not fully human because they're not able to access that complex fluidity of identity, of being able to move from place to place, from language to language. And at the same time, that question of, what you were talking about, George, those YouTube videos of, oh my gosh, the white person who speaks Mandarin, still highlights the hierarchy of one language as being the cultural norm and other languages as being somehow less than. And, I think you all addressed this question just, very compellingly. That quality of being at the same time visible as other, and therefore judged or questioned based on that visible otherness that is only dependent on how this category of whiteness is set up, but at the same time, being from places that are almost always invisible, as Suhan brought out so beautifully. On the one hand, you have this symbolic violence of erasure and exclusion, and all of this actual violence that we've seen taking place against people who are visibly categorized as other in this country. And one of the other questions that we've all seen arising and that we talked about before this event is the tension between Asian Americans and Black Americans, and people using that as sort of an excuse for some of the expressions of violence that we've seen recently. How is that question of tensions between minoritized communities in the US that Ilaheva started out talking about also an expression of white supremacy? And I'm going to start with Stefan.
So I have quite a bit to say about this, so please bear with me. I'll begin by first addressing that proverbial elephant in the room, that elephant being, of course, the question, does Black-Asian conflict or tension exist? And the answer to this question, like the answer to a lot of sociological inquiries, is it depends, right? So at a national level, the answer would be largely no. So data from a recent University of Michigan study albeit incomplete, shows that the vast majority, more than 90%, of reported violence and discrimination against Asians in the United States is committed by white folk, which means that they are overrepresented in the committing of racist acts against Asians relative to their population size, which is roughly around 65% of the overall population. Comparatively, people of color, who make up roughly 35% of the overall population, committed less than 10% of these acts, including Blacks, which is far less than their relative population size in this country. Again, this includes Black Americans. The answer is different at a local level. So there are several cities in this country, places like Los Angeles, New York, Atlanta, where there have historically been palpable tensions between Black and Asian communities, specifically Korean communities. For example, in 1990, Black and Haitian activists in Flatbush, Brooklyn, organized a community-wide boycott of Korean-owned grocery stores in response to acts of perceived discrimination and profiling by Korean store owners. In Los Angeles, just 2 years later, here I'm referencing the infamous Rodney King uprising, Rodney King riots. Largely Black and brown protesters targeted Koreatown and Korean-owned businesses in Los Angeles, actions that many said were in response to racist acts perpetrated by Korean store owners to their Black clientele. For example, some of you may remember the murder of Latasha Harlins by store owner Sun Ja-doo. So clearly something exists, right? Rappers like Ice Cube and Tupac wouldn't write entire songs about this if this tension didn't exist. And the song I'm referencing in particular from Ice Cube is Black Korea. So the problem then and now has always been how this tension has been framed by news media and then subsequently discussed in popular discourse. So research shows us that back in the 1990s, local and national news media were very quick to frame the events in New York and Los Angeles in particular as a product of Black Asian, or more specifically, Black Korean conflict. Political scientist Claire Jean Kim has called this the racial scapegoating narrative. But some of you may be thinking, like, why is this an issue? If there are visible tensions between Blacks and Koreans or Blacks and Asians in these given spaces, like, why not call a spade a spade? So the problem with this framing, as Kim and others have noted, is that it relies very heavily on a very simplistic victim-villain binary, whereby Black Americans are framed as being resentful of Asians to the point of then being willing to commit crimes against them. And then Asians are framed simply as these kind of model minority victims, as people who are simply in the wrong place at the wrong time and don't know why these things are happening to them. And usually ignored from this narrative is any nuancing of Black and Asian lives or an accounting of Black Asian tensions that takes into account systemic and historic racisms. For instance, what are the forces that have historically pushed Black Americans into the urban center? And what are the factors that have prevented the economic growth and development of these very regions? Furthermore, what are the factors that have pushed Asians or displaced Asians out of their homelands and into self-employment in the United States, especially the owning of small businesses in impoverished urban areas, areas in which Black Americans predominantly reside in the urban city? So the answer to all of these questions, things like redlining, white flight, job spatial mismatch, US neo-imperialism, job market segregation, are all forms of institutionalized or systemic racism or contingent upon it or related to it in some capacity, what we might refer to in the US as white supremacy. So more recently, with COVID-related anti-Asian violence, I've noticed the news media has largely swung the opposite direction. Even while many of the stories depicting anti-Asian violence in recent weeks that have gone viral have featured other people of color, namely Black Americans, the news media has, for the most part, not drawn attention to this demographic reality. It would appear on the surface then that in an attempt at redressing problematic coverage and frames from the past, the mainstream news media has decided to take an opposite approach, a colorblind approach. So while willing to acknowledge that racist acts against Asians exist, and that to some degree institutionalized racism exists, they seem unwilling to delve into the topic of interracial tension or interethnic tension, or that people of color can be complicit in upholding systemic racism. And I get it. These aren't easy waters to navigate by any means, but simply ignoring these topics doesn't help the situation either. And if anything, the silence serves as fodder for trolls in the alt and far right, like Hannity and Tucker Carlson, for example. So what needs to happen is a nuancing of this reality. So a recognition that there are conditions that contribute to these tensions that move beyond a simple, villain-victim binary. And more importantly, there needs to be attention paid to the alliances and bonds that Blacks and Asians have formed for decades, going as far back as the Civil Rights era, if not even before. So Asian American activists like Yuri Kuchiyama and Grace Lee Boggs, and groups such as the Yellow Pearl were central in advocating for civil and human rights and Black rights during the 60s and 70s. And Black activists were also central in the broader Third World Peoples movements, and also for decrying and protesting US militarism in Asia during the 60s and 70s. These solidarities need to be elevated and celebrated alongside any discussion of the supposed tensions as well.
Thank you, Stefan. Ilaheba?
Thank you so much, Stefan. I wanted to elaborate on one of the things that you said, is that people of color can participate in racism and uphold these systemic racist notions without possibly even knowing so. And so I wanted to go back to this and recall Andrea Smith's heteropatriarchy and the three pillars of white supremacy. And Smith so accurately describes the different ways that people of color experience racism in this country, and ways that people of color may also participate in systemic racism. And I just want to briefly mention those three things, and then we can go on to George. But for instance, Asian American Pacific Islanders all participate in the colonization and the continued genocide and idea of genocide of the Native American and indigenous people by settling here. And we continue that those notions of settler colonialism just by settling here. On top of that, Black Americans experience racism through capitalism and slavery and the history of slavery. And we can see that Black people experience racism through capitalism through the ways that they're prosecuted, persecuted, and prosecuted, and the ways that people respond to Black Lives Matter protests by saying, why do they go after their own neighborhoods? Which tells us that they experience, that they value the properties, these properties above the lives of Black people. And then on top of that, brown people experience racism through the Orientalism and war and the constant being constantly othered and the threat of the foreign other. And in this way, white supremacy is upheld through these three things. But also, we might, people of color might be participating in these pillars of white supremacy without knowing so. And thus, when they are direct violence towards the foreign other, they're participating in white supremacy. If they are capitalizing on their Black neighbors, they're participating in white supremacy. And so it's important even for people of color to realize the ways that they may be participating in systemic racism without even knowing so, because they are also at the same time experiencing racism. So if you're experiencing racism at the same, how can you also be continuing racism, right? And that disconnect is really where brown people and other people of color need to realize or can begin to build coalitions with each other through these recognitions.
Thank you. George?
Thank you very much, Stefan, for such a thorough analysis. And thank you, Eliheva, for this very important commentary on horizontal racism. There are a couple of things that I want to mention in relationship to this question. The first is sort of related to my discipline as an anthropologist that Kimbra has already brought up. And the first thing is that, we have to remember that the whole structure of race as we understand it today was a legacy of 18th and 19th century race science, where early anthropologists went around categorizing people, measuring heads, sorting people into groups, and saying this is what black means, this is what Asian means, this is what white means, and creating oftentimes very arbitrary distinctions about what these groups are. At one point in time, in the California census, Filipinos were considered black. And so a lot of times when we think about the legacy of white supremacy, it's very much ingrained into the very language that we have for even categorizing people into different groups. Of course, scholars from Boas onward have been very, very adamant about trying to disavow this kind of phrenological race science, this head measuring race science. But we still hold on to a lot of these distinctions because we assume that they're real and true. And in my own life, I have seen this come up, from a very young age, when I've heard family members drop the N-word with a hard R to describe people going by on the street, a family. And it's hard because I would know that that is something that they only say within the privacy of the car, that they don't say that out loud. I know that they're saying something that is wrong. And yet at the same time, I, as an Asian American who has a foot in a generation with significantly older parents and a foot in a younger generation with desires for justice, there is a sense in some ways that if I don't support and validate the language that's being used by a particular member of my family or a generation of people in my family, that I'm not fulfilling my obligations as being good kin. And so, what began as race science then ends up with the very sort of real struggle of sometimes Asian Americans are faced with the choice of having to betray their families by not reproducing a certain kind of anti-Black racism that for them was an important part of living and integrating into America at a certain point in history.
Thank you. And finally, Suhan.
Okay, thank you again. I'm learning so much from my co-panelists. So thanks, Stephanie, Eliheva, and George. And I'm sorry if there's some overlap between my response and what's already been said. I'll just begin by giving you a few examples of films and say other texts and so on that take up this relationship between South Asian Americans and African Americans. So Mira Nair's Mississippi Masala was, I think, one of these earliest efforts to do that, made in 1991, starring a very young Denzel Washington. And there are more recent texts, of course, like Wajahat Ali's play Domestic Crusaders, featuring a Pakistani American family that also addresses this somewhat tangentially. But for one of the earliest theoretical articulations of this tension and solidarity, as Stefan quite rightly noted, it's important to keep both these things in mind. So between, say, South Asian Americans and African Americans was made by Vijay Prashad in his book called The Karma of Brown Folk. And I just want to summarize, like, very briefly, some of the things that he said in his chapter called Of Anti-Black Racism. And he writes that white supremacy, of course, I mean, this is a surprise, creates a hierarchy among people with African Americans at the very bottom. And as George mentioned, I mean, as per this view, worldview, blackness means emptiness and failure, and has been used to label various groups of people at particular moments in history, right? That's why George's example was so, I think, so important. The revealing line from Prashad's article, and one that I find relevant to the subject at hand, is white supremacy does not endow all of Asia with equivalent value, right? So consequently, Indians, Chinese, and Japanese and Koreans were deemed to be culturally worthy, and say Cambodians and Vietnamese were not. And this stratification was accompanied by the rhetoric that called for various immigrant groups, including South Asians, to treat African American as non-citizens. And here Prashad quotes Toni Morrison, who said, "Only when the lesson of racial estrangement is learned is assimilation complete." It's also important to note that, as and I'm sure this has come up, in previous teachings and so on. So again, forgive me if I'm repeating information here, but it's important to note here that it was the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 that made it possible for South Asians and other immigrant groups from outside of North America, Europe, to immigrate to the United States in large numbers. And South Asians were promptly grouped with some other Asian Americans in this reductive category of model minority, and Stefan has brought this up on more than one occasion, a label that South Asians were very eager to accept. And then in turn, African Americans were denigrated by lauding, quote, Asian intelligence, right? And going back to what Stefan was saying, right, this is not to say that there have been no acts of solidarity. It's important to point this out. And a work of scholarship that I'd recommend highly in this regard is called Colored Cosmopolitanism by Nico Slate, that examines South Asian and African American solidarities beginning in the 19th century through the 1960s. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you all. That was just a beautiful job of situating this discussion in media and popular culture, as well as, some of what we're seeing going on. And Suhan, that quote of the lesson of racial estrangement, that's so powerful. Again, talking about the ways that these questions, and in a sense, the construction of both these fault lines and the solidarities that we're talking about in this panel are influenced through the ways these questions are framed in media and in popular discussion. Again, we had one question from Abby that has to do with whiteness as a constructed category. And, I think part of what we're talking about is that whiteness is also a constructed cultural category, but one that is constructed specifically to be invisible, so that we don't that we don't recognize it, we don't see it, we don't question it. And that means that, if we can construct whiteness and yet not recognize it as a cultural construction, as a category, that enables white supremacy to be an also invisible byproduct, or an often invisible byproduct of that cultural construction, which reinforces what you're all saying about needing nuance and complexity in discussion. And Abby's question is, kind of the flip side of this. What does it mean to be authentically white? And authentically is in quotes there. What does it mean to reinforce and not challenge white supremacy? And maybe I should be the one who's got that question thrown at them, but you can feel free to throw it back at me. But does any of you want to speak on that? What would, on the one hand, what does it mean to be authentically white? If that's invisible, is that even something that we're aware of constructing? And on the other hand, how can we challenge white supremacy? Are there other thoughts you'd like to add?
I'll start just quickly, and I think that you framed it so well. Is that the problem with white supremacy is that there is no need to be authentically white. As long as you are white, you are authentic enough. There is not the whiteness is the authenticity. I'll stop there.
I could sort of chime in here. I mean, what's interesting is when I kind of talk about this in my classes. I mean, I have these two. I mean, again, and many probably, not just two, but two that I'm aware of, right? Different subject positions that I occupy, right? When I'm in the United States as opposed to when I'm in India, right? So here, yes, again, I'm kind of seen and marked in a particular way. But back in India, I'm part of the majority community, right? I am an upper caste Hindu male. It doesn't get more privilege than that, right? And so it's interesting when I kind of came here to the States and I was thinking about, and I started to kind of, read and teach, about sort of white privilege and so forth. I was like, oh my gosh, right? I mean, one of the reasons why, I maybe have this, at least then, and it's maybe somewhat more contentious now, this unproblematic relationship to home is because I can easily slide into that category, right? And no one is going to, just like Ilheva was saying, no one's going to ask me that, are you Indian, right? And the way you figure this out in India is they ask you what's your full name, and when you say that, okay, my last name is X, Y, or Z, they say, okay, fine, you checked all the right boxes, right? And as far as how can we challenge white supremacy? I mean, I don't think I'm being facetious here. A good first step would be to sign up for all our classes.
And I was actually going to ask all of you, because we have, about 5-7 minutes left, what classes are you offering that people in our audience could take to learn more about these issues? Because we're getting a lot of comments saying, thank you, this is amazing, this is such a deep, riveting, thoughtful discussion, etc. How can our audience learn more about some of these questions? George, your mic's.
I forgot I already unmuted it, but thank you all. Thank you, Kimbra and Ilheva and Stefan and Suhan for having this wonderful conversation. I am going to be teaching this fall the Anthropology of Global Christianity, which in many ways is an exploration into sort of the close relationship between Christianity and understandings of whiteness through the colonial encounter, but also through the ways that Christianity is practiced around the world. And then in the following spring, I'll be teaching 2 other courses. One course called Food and Empire, which is on the development of the American agricultural system, but for me is sort of a stand-in for how we understand race in America, insofar as so much of what we eat ends up defining who we are. And then I'll also be teaching another class that deals with race as well, which is anthropology, labor, and social transformation. And in that course, one of the issues that we will talk about is what does it mean to engage in the labor of producing identity, whether that be a white identity, an ethnic minority identity, or even a gender identity.
Thank you. Ilaheba?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I teach Intro to Social Justice, Introduction to Social Justice, where we explore all kinds of systems of oppression, racism, sexism, ageism, religious oppression, and so many other things. I also teach a follow-up class to that called WAP, Women and Protests, and it's an intro to femme theory. And it's a real good follow-up to that introduction to social justice issues. And I also teach a class in the spring called South Sea Tales. And in that class, we really get into decolonial ideas, indigenous ideas, and the creation of these Pacific Island paradises that we still enjoy today. But thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Suhan?
Hi, and those are really exciting classes, George and Ilaheva. And thanks, Kimbra, for asking us that question. So in the fall, I'll be teaching 2 sections of global Anglophone literature. That's the second part of that course, and it's the 20th, 21st century. And starting actually last fall, and this is why I was so excited about this Asian Studies minor that we have now, right? That I have kind of redesigned this course to kind of yes, think about colonialism and its aftermath, but also go beyond it, right? So we'll be studying texts that were written after Indian independence in 1947 in English. There's maybe like one in translation, where we'll be taking up some of these issues, but also in a sense we are not going to be obsessed with empire all the time. As one of my favorite historians, Ram Guha, said when he went to England, that I am not coming here to defend the empire, but I'm coming here to bury it, right? So we'll do the empire, but we'll go beyond that as well. And then I'm doing a seminar on the literature of 9/11. So where we'll be looking at fiction and some film by US authors, but also by writers either originally from Pakistan or from Iraq. So kind of thinking about 9/11 from a national and also kind of a global lens. So I look forward to seeing some of you in these courses. Thank you.
Thank you. And Stefan?
Yeah, I'd love to enroll in all these courses. They sound fantastic. I teach 3 courses in the fall, which I've advertised in previous events. So I teach Asian American communities every fall, with a 3,000 level course cross-listed with sociology, West, and history. I also teach gender and sexuality, which is a 4,000 level course cross-listed with sociology and West. And then finally, global migration, which is also a 4,000 level course, 4 credits actually, and is cross-listed across GES, Geography and Environmental Studies, West, and Sociology. And all of them take a critical race, critical ethnic studies, critical gender studies, intersectional approach to those topics. So if you're into that type of thing, you'll be in the right place. And in the spring, I teach a course that I think relates to the final question, or the question by Abby really well, this question about whiteness and white supremacy. So I teach Introduction to Race and Ethnicity. This is really a starter course for all things race, ethnicity, and culture, right? So what is race? What is ethnicity? What is systemic racism? What is whiteness, white supremacy, and so forth? And we learn in that course, among other things, that whiteness and white supremacy are what we refer to as kind of like culturally hegemonic institutions or systems, right? And any culturally hegemonic or dominant system is maintained by the dominant group or the ruling class within a given society, but because it's culturally based, it can always be toppled. It can always be reformed. And so if there's, I do try to end the semester on a glimmer of hope to tell us that these types of constructs and isms aren't definite and impervious, but rather that with knowledge, with activism, things can change for the better. And then also teach West Capstone, which is limited to West majors, which might actually be, encouragement for people to become West majors.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists today. I will let you all know, because you're not watching the YouTube chat, all of you have been commended for the quality of your courses as well as for what you've been contributing today. And I've really enjoyed the chance to, thank you for letting me moderate this. I've enjoyed the discussion immensely. Thanks to all of you, and thanks to everyone who tuned in to watch this and to think about some of the questions that our panelists are raising. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
The song of love, song of love, song of love. Song of love.
Draw near, draw near. All things are forgotten. Walk on.